In this video, we will show you how to replace your upper ball joint on this Honda Accord. This is part of your front suspension located inside of your front wheel well. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. The first thing we need to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle with the wheels off the ground and the suspension hanging. Once you've done so, continue on to removing all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts and then the wheel. Once the wheel's out of the way, we'll be removing the 32mm axle nut. If you find when you're trying to turn this counterclockwise to remove it, this wants to rotate, you can either step on the brake, holding it still, or put a pry bar coming down diagonally in between the lug studs, being careful not to damage them. We'll use a hammer and punch right in the center of the axle to break this free. Now that you have movement from here, we'll continue on up along the upper control arm. Let's follow our ABS wire all the way up to where it connects onto the upper control arm. You'll find that you have a 10mm headed nut to remove. Take hold of that bracket, give it a wiggle, and pull it down and out of there. That's going to give us plenty of slack from this ABS wire. Let's continue on at the upper ball joint nut. To remove this, we'll be removing the cotter pin and then the 17mm nut. We'll set that aside for recycling. It's a good idea to replace those. Give the nut a quick inspection and then start it on the ball joint threads, just a couple threads. Now we can separate this joint. Since you're replacing the ball joint anyways, you could use a pickle fork if you wanted to. If you don't have a pickle fork to get in between this area, just go ahead and use the hammer and give the knuckle a couple loving bonks. Take hold of that upper control arm, pull it down towards the knuckle. Now we'll remove that nut. Once you lift this up and out of here, we're going to carefully start pulling the knuckle away. But you need to be extremely careful. You have several things still attached to it. You have your axle going through the center of the wheel bearing, and you also have your brake flex hose that you want to pay attention to. Continue on to removing the boot from your upper ball joint. Once you've done that, we'll continue by cutting off the stud of the upper ball joint so we can press this up and out. Now that we have the boot off of there, let's go ahead and clean up the ball joint stud. It's important to have a quick look inside this area. Now this is a little bit hard to see. I have another ball joint that I can show you right in my hand. As for these upper ball joints, they need to be put in place in the proper positioning. You can see that it has a groove that makes its way from the outboard side of the car towards the inboard side of the car. If you were to put this in sideways, the suspension will not be able to pivot properly and you're going to have an issue. So when we go to put in the brand new ball joint, you want to make sure you have it in this same orientation. To press this out of here with the ball joint press, it will be easiest if you cut off the stud for the ball joint. Once you've done that, you can take the driver and drive this right on up and through. Use my cutting wheel for this. We'll set this aside for recycling. Once we have the stud off of there, we should have a pretty smooth base here. We can continue on with the ball joint press. To press the ball joint out, you want to make sure you have a cup that fits directly over the ball joint, but does go up against the control arm itself. We'll continue on with that ball joint press, slide it right on over the top there. Now we can start driving this up and out of here. Once you have your tool completely situated, let's go ahead and apply some upward pressure on this. It's going to drive the ball joint up and inside the cup. There's the rest of our ball joint. Once you have the ball joint out of there, make sure you clean and inspect the mounting hole. Now we can get ready to install our brand new upper ball joint. Before we start pressing this down and through the control arm into place, we need to remove the boot. To remove the boot, you'll find that you have a locking clip that makes its way all the way around the boot, holding it onto the ball joint. Use a small pick or a small screwdriver to pop that out of place. We will be reusing the clip, and you do not want to damage the boot. Just make our way right in here, gently start prying it up. Remove the boot, give it a quick inspection, and set that aside. Now we'll remove the clip from the area as well. That should just slide right down and off of there. Quick inspection. Now we'll pay attention to the bottom of that ball joint. You remember I had mentioned that it is oblong in that lower aspect. It can be a little bit hard to see due to the fact that there's grease in this area. Make sure that it's facing in the proper direction. Let's take this and slide it right on down through that control arm. We'll have a peek directly under here just to confirm that we're lined up properly. If it's off by even a little bit, you could potentially have an issue. Now to press this down and in here, once you've confirmed you're properly aligned, you want to make sure you press along the outer aspect of the ball joint itself. Never directly along the center because you will cause issues with the joint. This will slide right over the top, making sure that I'm not pressing on the center at all. Now I'll use a cup that has a base. We'll make sure that the ball joint can slide through this, but the base does rest up against the control arm. Now we can put the ball joint press in position. Once you have it in place so it's going in as straight as possible, we want to make sure that we have the bottom of the top of the base of the ball joint pressed all the way down against the top of the control arm. Once you feel as though it's completely against the top of that control arm, we'll use a hammer. I'm going to tap along this area here to cause some vibration, just in case it's not completely seated all the way. You want to make sure you do this while there's still pressure on the joint. Let's remove the ball joint press. Now that this is secured to the control arm, we'll continue on with our locking ring that will go over the protective boot. We'll just bring this up and slide it in place. We're going to slide it up and over this groove that's on the ball joint. Once we've done that, we can take that boot and we'll slide it in position. Slide the locking clip over it to hold it on the ball joint. Just got to make our way around. Reinstall your boot. Slide that up on there. As for the boot, you want to make sure it's completely seated inside of the groove on the ball joint itself. Slide that right up on there. Just have to work our hands around it. Give it a couple spins just to ensure that it is actually seated properly. Now we'll slide that locking ring directly onto where that groove on the ball joint would be. This part can be a little bit tedious because you may start pulling the ball joint boot out of place. You also want to be careful with that pick so you don't damage the brand new boot. If you do, you have to replace the boot. There we are. We'll just confirm that the boot is secured to the control arm and to the ball joint. That feels good. Let's resecure the knuckle to that upper ball joint. As we start bringing it into the proper position, pay attention to your axle. We want to make sure that it is pushing through the wheel bearing as it should. That axle, oh yeah, that looks good. Bring this down into the proper position. Start on the nut, snug it up, and then torque it to 35 foot-pounds. Now, once you have that torque to the proper specification, the next thing you want to do is pay attention to the slots that are on the mounting nut in comparison to the hole that goes through the center of the stud. If one of those slots is not aligned with the hole, Continue tightening the mounting nut until the very next slot is. After that, put in your locking cotter pin. Slide that right on through there. When you have your cotter pin through there, you want to make sure that you peen it over so there's no way that this nut can loosen up on you while you're driving down the road. Let's resecure our ABS wire bracket to that upper control arm. Start the nut on there, snug it up, and torque it to 7.2 foot-pounds. Confirm that it's properly secured, and you can move along. Now let's continue on with the axle nut. We'll start this on by hand, and then you always want to make sure you snug it up with your ratchet. Never use an impact tool on this because you could damage the bearing. Once you have it bottomed out, it's going to be time to torque this to 134 foot-pounds. To torque this, you will find that it's going to want to spin on you. So what you'll have to do is either have a second person holding on the brake pedal, or you can just use a pry bar coming down across those studs. If you're going to do that, you want to make sure you have it in an angle that it's not going to cause any damage to the threads. Let's torque this axle nut to 134 foot-pounds. Once you've done that, you're going to want to pay attention to the small slot on the axle. We have to use a hammer and punch and drive the very edge of the nut down into that slot. That'll lock it into this position. There we are. Now we can put on the wheel. Once you have that in place, continue on with your 19mm lug nuts. We'll start them in, bottom them out, get the wheel safely back on the ground. Once we've done that, we can torque these to 80 foot-pounds. Torqued. Okay friend, we showed you how to install the upper ball joint on your vehicle. At this point, you want to take your vehicle for a road test, listen for any funny noises, and get yourself safely down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.